All right. So we were having some technical difficulties here. Hopefully, those are behind us. But one of the things we were talking about was just the fact that if you consider the tyranny that we had at the time of the revolution, at the time of the founding of this nation, then you have to consider the tyranny that we have right now. I mean, it's unquestionable, and this is kind of like the example of the frog. If you put him in a pot of, lukewarm water, right, and then you turn on the oven, you keep turning up or not the oven, but the stovetop, and you keep turning up the heat. Eventually, the water will be boiling, and the frog will be boiled to death, but he'll be so comfortable right up until that point that he won't even notice the heat escalated, the heat rising. He won't notice until it's too late, right? And that's kind of where we're at, where we've allowed all of these little tyrannies around us, these smaller ones in different areas, all of these government overreaches, usurping authority from, usually it's from the family, but also from the church, to the point that um, in 2020, you actually had people just laying down for literally whatever the civil government said, even if it was clearly, even today, by today's standard, outside of the scope of their authority, certainly outside of the biblical scope of their authority, which just on a daily basis, they are overstepping their bounds, right? And from a constitutional perspective, even. So you just look at the um, the three letter agencies that we have, the proliferation of those, and the amount of power that they wield that is not delegated to them in the Constitution, right? A federal, in most cases, it's a federal authority, which they're not supposed to have. The states and even like the counties and municipalities should really be having some of that authority, and even then, most of those. Most of those things should be under the family sphere of authority, right? So you see government overreach on a daily basis. Amos Miller has been having to go through a go around with another go around with the federal government and the courts, who are after him simply for selling raw milk, raw dairy. Um, eh, and it's something that people have been drinking and or eating for centuries, right, with no problems. And there was no complaint by any of his customers whatsoever. This is just an overreach. They decided they had it in for him and they wanted to get him, right? And they wanted to go after him. And you see the Department of Justice cracking down on people who have been peacefully standing or sitting outside of abortion clinics. And in one case, this one was dropped, but praise God for it. But the first of these instances recently, there was a man who um, was just praying outside with his son, right? And his son was being harassed and accosted by this man, and all he did was push the man away from his son to defend his son. Didn't injure the man, and certainly the man, even if he had clearly initiated that, and um, he would have warranted the father to be defending his son with physical force or aggression if need be, right? And so the courts initially threw it out, and then of course the Department of Justice gets involved. They try to bring this guy up on the FACE Act, and it gets thrown out again. But now they're using it on others, right? And they're going to keep pressing on this until the courts roll over, right? Or until God's people stand up, we take the lead and we say, no, absolutely not. This is unjust. This is tyrannical and immoral, right? And I mean, doing stuff on social media and those kind of things, that's important. Writing letters and making phone calls is important. Sometimes that can be very effective work, right? But we need to be visible and vocal. We need to put ourselves on the line on behalf of these brethren, right? But we need numbers, right? We need numbers, and we need our most influential people, right? They have to be the ones to put themselves on the line, and ultimately, if they don't, they shouldn't have any weight. There should be no gravitas to their words. We shouldn't give them any attention whatsoever, any authority, any influence whatsoever, if they're not willing to do that, right? Clearly, if ever there was an injustice, if ever there was a time to stand up or speak up, be seen, be heard, if ever there was a time to spend some of that cultural capital that they keep talking about, that they say that we have, it is for these cases, right? Heather Idoni is an example of one. You have cases right now where you have a father of two very young children, right? Has harmed absolutely no one, facing jail time, right? You have a woman in her 80s who, again, has harmed and threatened no one. They want her in jail for over a decade, right? And on it goes, right? Some of these people I know in person. Some of these people are friends and wonderful, tremendous, faithful brothers and sisters in the Christian faith. Some of these people I know through social media, and have known through social media in some cases for as much as 10 or 11 years, because these were people I was connecting with when the Lord convicted my heart and changed my heart regarding getting active in open air evangelism, and especially the abolitionist movement. And then over time, I befriended more and more. But these are people who are faithful brothers and sisters, and we should have a desire to stand with them, right? So, and that's just, I mean, again, look at all the COVID tyranny and all the COVID theater. I mean, we were being lied to our faces on a daily basis, and we just took it. We had ridiculous demands being placed on us, and many of us just took it, right? Um, people telling people that they couldn't work, that they had to stay in their house unless there were certain circumstances, that they needed to wear a mask when they left there. You had people wearing their masks in their cars when they were in their cars by themselves. You had people out in the middle of the woods by themselves wearing masks. This is ridiculous. It's foolish, right? And the masks didn't work. There were people who knew it, right, and who wouldn't play along with the game, and I'm glad for that. Right, there's a point where the people said, "Yeah, we're done with this," right? But the problem is that point needs to be immediately, right? There's some of these things, once momentum is built towards these kind of tyrannies, like once it really starts to escalate, right, it's going to be pretty hard to stop, right? Like it's going to cost a lot more to stop it then, right? But we're like the frog sitting in the pot. We don't want to acknowledge it, right? Uh, you had men willing to bleed the ground red and die in the American Revolution for a tax that is a mere fraction of just what we pay for, income tax, or again, just a mere fraction of what we pay for property tax, or mere fraction of um, what people pay for capital gains. You have all these various different taxes, right? We are taxed to death, right? There are people who pay more for lodging tax than this tax that sparked the American Revolution, right? And it was righteously so, right? So we need to learn to just. It's not just about us and our possessions and our rights, and that's often the argument, that you'll hear from these pietists in your evangelical church circles, right? Who they want to point the finger and cast aspersions at people who are saying, no, we need to stand up, like people's rights are being violated here. And, they'll say, oh, they assume a horrible motive, right? You're just greedy. You just care about your rights. You don't want anything negative to ever happen to you. And so, you know, that's why, you're so political, right? And it's like, no, I believe in Christian ethics, right, in every sphere of life, including the political sphere, because that's what the Bible teaches us, is that we should be applying God's precepts, God's standards to every sphere of life, right? And if I know that my neighbors are being oppressed in some way, being hurt, that they're losing that which God has given them and blessed them with, and there can't be a justification for it. So it's for no good reason, right? Um, there could be a PR job for it to sell it to the people, right? But at the end of the day, it's not their authority. It's not something that should be happening. People's rights are being violated, and there's a price to pay for that, right? And if they don't go along with it, there's even bigger price to pay, right? Because ultimately, all of these things are enforced by threat of imprisonment or by threat of death, right? Ultimately, an agent with a gun is the person who is going to be enforcing this, right? Somewhere along the line. And so, we shouldn't just sit there like the frog in the boiling pot, waiting for it to, kind of reach its zenith of oppression, the zenith of evil and tyranny, before we wake up. And what is horrible, right? This is the part uh, also that seems really disingenuous. And this is where I'm going to step aside a little bit from what Owen is saying, but this is very pertinent to what he was saying. But to get into what some other figures online who are actually closer to my camp even have said, and they imply that the Christian nationalists, or sometimes even the theonomists, they'll imply this, but usually it's the Christian nationalists. They'll say that we want a tyrant, right? And to be charitable to them, it could be that they just were ham-fistedly, sloppily listening to or considering the words of certain speakers, and they're not really asking the right questions, right? And so they think that what these people want is someone to just rule with an iron fist, when actually, when you listen to them, they say, no, what we would prefer is like a representative republic. We prefer something that would be less authoritarian than, some kind of tyrannical iron fisted rule. Um, and But we do see that what's probably going to happen, or is probably just the way it has to start out, not our preference, right? Not what we're pushing for, but like someone who comes to power and they implement good changes, but with an iron fist and in a very authoritarian way, right? And some of this idea is that, again, they're saying, well, if the Constitution is dead, right, then we're just playing into the enemy's hands when we say, well, we're just gonna rely on the Constitution, right? That's what's gonna deliver us. No, it's not. It's not. And for you to even consider that, you have to be willing to, as a whole, as a massive group of God's people, right? So that means you really have to rally all the troops, right? You have to get entire churches, and when I say entire churches, I mean like not just yours and maybe one or two others, but I mean numerous entire churches and individual Christians from other churches that maybe aren't involved. Like, you need to get them all together and as a mass, as a unit, push for these kind of things, right? And and even then say basically, hey, we're not taking no for an answer, right? Like, have some risk to it, right? Um, so anyhow, um, even let's just pretend that they actually want this iron-fisted ruler, right? They want someone who is going to have good, righteous laws and good, righteous rulings and practices, right? That our national policies and our state policies and our county and city policies are going to be righteous, right? And so they're looking for um, leaders who will do that. And who will courageously do that. And they're saying realistically, because of the way we have butchered our Constitution, and also because of how tremendously immoral our populace is, even those who call Christ their Lord, right? In our nation, that's not everyone, obviously. I'm not saying everyone who calls Christ Lord is tremendously immoral, but a large percentage of those who do are, right? And it's clear, right? 50 years ago, you would not have had Christians in churches, especially in Reformed churches, but in any Bible believing church who would be promoting sodomy, right? It just wouldn't happen. But now you do. Now it's commonplace for many of them to have women preachers and pastors, elders, whatever, their consistory boards and so forth, right? So, anyhow, the point of this is if you have this iron-fisted but ethical ruler, and that's a transitionary period, even that would be what we would say, okay, if such a person were to take over, that's not ideal, but if they do, the ideal is to quickly move towards a more righteous form of government, right? But to have them do a good work in the upfront, right? You could have that person, right? And or you could have the tyrants that we have now, but like worse and worse versions of them, right? It should be obvious, even with the tyrants we have right now, right? It should be obvious which of the two that we want. But these folks don't want to see it because they want to attribute even worse motives, and they want to attribute all these other things. And one thing that Christians need to learn and really internalize, right, is that even though there have been some bad things that have happened during Christendom in the past, either by the Roman Catholic Church when it was them, or even by some of the Protestants, when you got to the Massachusetts Bay Colony, right? They had the greatest standard of living, the greatest culture, the most good and true liberty for their people. Just the most just laws, the most righteousness of any group of people, right? Like it was the best, right, in the Massachusetts Bay Colony of any people, right, ever. And you look at that, you look at all the enormous good and enormous liberty and enormous justice and opportunity and whatnot. Some of it had to develop through time, right? But that Christendom brought, right? When you look at that, right? And you even look at what the founders were trying to do here prior to the Constitution, right? You look at all those things, right? And then you somehow want to say that it would be preferable to have political paganism, political polytheism. You say that, you want, leftist, humanist, secularist, Satanist tyrants to be your rulers, right? That's preferable to you, which is really what you're saying, right? But these people think that, just because, here's my point, right? This is the thing that Christians have to internalize, that just because there are certain cases that have been blown out of proportion, have been repeated ad nauseum throughout history, right? Rare, isolated cases of bad things happening, right? The overall body of work and the overall justice, the overall goodness of it, the overall righteousness of it, right? All of those things completely overwhelms and outshines every other attempt at government throughout history, and it completely um, uh, tips the balance of the scales from those few instances. And so we need to internalize that we shouldn't be so fearful of this one thing happening. We can learn from our history and not repeat the bad mistakes, right? But do all of the good things that we had done, right? Which is what we should do, what we need to do. We can't be in this mindset of like, oh, it's going to be like, the Roman Catholic Church during the Spanish Inquisition, right? Like that's the only option, right? It's either Spanish Inquisition or Sharia law, or Spanish Inquisition, or Biden on steroids, right? As if those are the only options, right? But the option that you have needs to be explicitly Christian, and it needs to be explicitly righteous and explicitly just, right? With true biblical liberty, and not just, like the kind of pagan libertarian type of liberty where it's completely unprincipled, and what it does is it promotes slavery to sin, right? We need to avoid that. So continuing on, Owen Strachan, he made a lot of comments about Christian nationalists being anarchists and wanting to be anarchists, and that's just foolish. And I think what he's trying to refer to, even though he's wrong and he's making a complete straw man, and I'm quite sure that he knows it, right? Because he's too smart for that, at least I believe he's too smart for that. I want to give him credit and give him the honor, that he should be due. I believe he's due, right? Looking at the doctrine of the lesser magistrate and wanting to see them to step in and potentially say, hey, if they won't listen to these lesser magistrates, if they continue to push this tyranny, rebellion is justifiable, right? That is not anarchy, and that's not desiring anarchy. What they want is the civil magistrates to uphold order and justice and to protect their people like they're supposed to do, like God has called and commissioned them to do, right? But they also want to say, look, if it comes to it, it is sometimes righteous, just like in the American Revolution, for there to be some type of revolt. They're not saying that they want that. That's not what they're running to. They're just saying we're ready for that, right? You have to be prepared for that. And Owen Strachan really seems to have essentially zero category for that, and that's not good. That's not right. Because then it's like how many babies need to be dismembered, right? How many kids need to be sterilized and transed, right? How many families need to be rented apart, right? How many Christian missionaries and evangelists need to be imprisoned, right? Probably when they'll take notice is when they start going directly for the pulpits, right? The seminaries and the pulpits. Then your people like Owen Strachan will look around to see if there's anyone left to support them, right? But probably everybody who would be in jail already, right, or dead. So you have to have a category for that type of protection from tyranny, and yes, even revolt. But it doesn't mean anarchy. And really, what they want is to establish order, right? And in many cases, we don't have order. We have more anarchy now than these people are advocating for. In every case, every point that Owen Strachan tries to bring up, he's actually ignoring a ton of evidence in front of him. He's ignoring the times. It's like he's insulated and ignorant to everything that's going on around him, right? Which is a problem. If you're in that position, you shouldn't be commenting. If you're not either paying very close attention to the culture through social media and the news, or from being out doing one-on-one evangelism amongst the people, the populace, the everyday people, the common people, or whatever. If you're not doing that, and you're not at the universities and the abortion clinics, and you're not on the sidewalks and so forth, the parks, right? If you're not doing those kind of things, you should be staying back and staying out of this, right? If you're not in some way or other seeing what the common sentiments are and what types of actions are going on and what people are doing, right, and how they're thinking, right, you have no business. You can't be in fantasy land and telling everybody else that they need to be there too, right? You don't have that right. So you have to have a category for righteous rebellion um, and need to understand what time it is, right? So um, then Owen said something really interesting. He said he says he can't tell you where the line is for Christians to take actions, but he says he has that category. Now I was just talking about he seems that he doesn't. Well, that's the problem. Is he gives lip service to the idea. Well, there is some time in some place, there is a line that can be drawn, but I don't know where it is. So he's wanting you to be as ignorant and ambivalent as he is, right? Because he doesn't know where that line is. He gets all squirrely and uncomfortable if you do, right? He's not even willing to engage on whether or not we've gotten to that line or if we're close to it, right? He just wants you to say, oh, there's a line out there somewhere, and let's put our heads in the sand, live in fantasy land, and keep plodding on like we always have, right? That's wrong, right? He's wrong. Um, so, there were some of the things he complained about, some terminology that Andrew Torba used, calling it trash world. That's what he, other people call it clown world. He doesn't like that. I think, he just needs to understand the times. And he also needs to understand how far we in our culture have fallen, right? Like he's trying to look at some of the worst examples, right? And say, well, if if we're not as bad as them or worse, right, then we can't call it trash world. Well, I don't even really generally use that term. I mean, once in a while I might say something like that, but I really don't use that terminology. But the problem is that he ignores like all the ways that we are worse, right? All the ways that we're just as bad, all the ways that we're just as unjust, all the ways that we're just as evil or even worse, right? Caesar didn't have a surveillance state, right? Caesar didn't have technology that predicted your every move as well as technology that tracked your every move and could use facial recognition technology and recognize the way that you walk and all speech patterns and all these other things, right? They didn't have medical records that could be accessed, and all these things, right? They didn't have a whole group of state agents, right, that all were in electronic communication, that had electronic devices that could go around and monitor you and follow you. They didn't have that, right? And that's just one thing, right? They didn't have people that were infringing on the family the way that we do now, right? Like families always historically made their own medical choices. They made their own education choices. Um, and just because Christians aren't being dipped in wax and lit on fire in this country, uh, keep in mind in much of the rest of the world, like that's not far from the truth, right? But just because that isn't happening doesn't mean you can't look at the whole picture, right, and everything and say, okay, clearly it's not as bad in that area in that specific way yet, right? But look at all these other things that are going on, right? Um, it's just ridiculous. And then I wanted to get to what I think is a big problem with people like Owen Strachan, people who listen to him, people who are in his circles or think like him. They make a lot of assumptions. They hear one thing and then they assume it must mean another, right? And this is not a good tactic. It's not right. And so he thinks that these are people who want to opt out on suffering, right? He thinks that these are people who don't have a theology of suffering, that they don't have a worldview that includes that. He thinks that these are people that are just trying to escape that any way that they can. And he kind of paints it in like this real selfish light and the real cowardly light, even though the people in his position who are having his kind of takes are always the ones being cowardly. And they're always the ones who are avoiding the suffering, right? It's like gaslighting. This is like, I, here's the thing though, I have to say, it almost seems like there's like a cognitive dissonance with him. Like I have to believe that some of this is like this massive blind spot, right? Because otherwise, I have to believe that he is intentionally gaslighting everyone, right? In several different ways. Like this is a master class on gaslighting, if that's what he's doing, right? Um, but the people who are theonomists, the people who are Christian nationalists, the people who are abolitionists, the people who are out there, and these, by the way, these are predominantly all the same people, right? Or they're all in the same groups, right? The people who are out there doing street evangelism and open air preaching, the people who are trying to transform their communities, right, and establish justice, and the people who are being really politically active, the people who are going out on a limb and calling these things out on like social media and on their particular platforms. These are always the people who are getting persecuted. It could be low level persecution, meaning like the reviling and scoffing and insults and so forth. They're people that others are trying to cancel, right? So these people can lose jobs and sometimes do, lose customers and whatnot. So they lose money, a lot of it. These are the people that are being taken to court and they're losing money, sometimes hemorrhaging money for um, to pay their legal fees. These are people who are going into jail sometimes and getting criminal records for this and having to deal with police. I mean, I can tell you that it's probably triple digits now the number of times I've had to interact with police for doing nothing wrong, right? Literally breaking no laws, and definitely not any of God's laws, right? Um, so, and that's just me. And some of these people have gotten it far worse, right? Um, and then you look at the fact that people like have you, Mr. Strahan? I don't know this. Maybe he has, right? It'd be good to know if he has, and know that kind of like have him share some of the details of it if he would. But has he ever been assaulted for the sake of the gospel and proclaiming it, right? And if so, in what context, right? Has he ever, had to consider whether or not that was going to happen? Has he ever sat there and considered whether or not he was going to be attacked and or be arrested in the same day, right? I have almost every street evangelist and open air preacher has, right? So you're talking about people who are putting their money where their mouth is. You're talking about people who are risking their liberty, risking their safety, their lives, right? Like these are people who are putting a lot on the line. And so when I hear somebody like Owen Strachan, I keep saying Owen Strachan. I think it's Strachan actually is the pronunciation. So please forgive me if that's how it's supposed to be pronounced. Anyhow, it does make me really angry when I hear people like Owen Strachan, and he's trying to imply that these are just some cowardly people trying to escape any form of persecution when we're the ones who are actually experiencing it. We're the ones who have a theology of it. We're the ones who have a theology not only that it is going to happen and that we need to accept it when it does in the right ways, right? But that we have a theology that tells us that we have to put ourselves in positions where that could happen, right? If we're being faithful, right? And the only way that we wouldn't be is if we were in a really righteous, God honoring, Christ loving society, right? That's the only way, because otherwise you have to put yourself out there in a position where that's likely to happen, right? I think it was Steve Lawson once famously asked the question, like, why is nobody trying to kill me? And then he also made the comment that the problem with preachers today is that nobody wants to kill them, right? And it's a perfect the perfect statement and is a perfect illustration of the entire problem with Owen's thinking, is that all of these things point out his blind spots, his inconsistencies, areas where he's being cowardly or he's just not obeying God, right, for whatever reason, right, and others like him, right. And what they do is they turn around and they make these insinuations about God's people who are being faithful, right, and say that they're the ones who are trying to avoid persecution. Well, tell you what, Owen, right? Why don't you come out to Michigan here with me, right? And we can spend some time, preaching at the abortion clinics. We can spend some time at the Pride festivals. We can spend some time, go to a couple college campuses and things like that, and we can deal with the police, and without kowtowing to every little thing that they say, but rather, standing on our convictions, right? What God has commanded us to do, upholding the liberties, not just of us, but of other people. See, this is a big problem, is that when he thinks we're trying to avoid persecution, we're actually trying to avoid people like you, people like him, from being persecuted in that way. Because if we give away our rights, you guys lose your rights, and so does he. And so the fact that people just don't see that is mind-boggling to me. And to the point where it makes me wonder if they do see it and don't care, or they just refuse to acknowledge it. Um, so, all right. So one of the things I wanted to point out to Owen, because if you remember earlier, I mentioned he keeps bringing up the New Testament as though that is the only source of teaching, of information, of ethics and rules for the Christian life, and that there's nothing that we can be gleaning or gaining from the Old Testament, right? And I think it's because if he considers his political theology and he looks at anything in the Old Testament, it immediately refutes everything that he's saying, right? As well as upholds Christendom or Christian history, which also refutes everything that he is saying, right? And the problem is that, number one, the New Testament leans on the Old Testament a lot. The Apostle Paul upholds the Old Testament laws, the civil laws, numerous times throughout the New Testament. Sometimes he applies them in different ways, right? Which we agree with. Theonomists agree with that, right? The problem is you have some people who just decide there's certain laws and certain penalties that they just don't like, and they don't want to come right out and just say that, right? They don't want to come out and just say, you know what, I think this was unrighteous, unjust, right? Because then it becomes, and they know it becomes them trying to judge God and his law. And they don't want to do that because they know that other people will recognize that they're doing that. And so instead, what they try to do is create all this confusion, right? And they want to muddy the waters by saying, oh, well, you only look to the New Testament, and because the New Testament leans so heavily on the Old Testament, you have to really understand the Old Testament and the law of God to be able to understand a lot of what is being said. If you jettison that completely, then it's all this, essentially this subjective interpretation, right? It can go any which way, right? You can make it like Gumby, and it can bend however you want to, right? And I think that's really what they're after, and I find that condemnable, right? We should have a consistent, solid, objective political theology grounded in the whole of Scripture, right? So here's one thing that he said. Owen Strachan said there's no call in the Great Commission or anywhere else to make a Christian nation, and that is utterly stupid. And I'm sorry, I can't say it any nicer way. Okay, Psalm 2, we read that earlier. I'll read it again. Now, therefore, O kings, be wise, be warned, O rulers of the earth. I started in verse 10. Serve the Lord with fear and rejoice with trembling. Kiss the Son, lest he be angry and you perish in the way. This is talking to rulers and kings, right? This is not just saying this is about your personal salvation. This is talking about kings and rulers, right? So it makes his comment just ridiculous. Let's look at the Great Commission, shall we? Jesus came and said to them, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. Right? So Jesus is saying, make disciples of all of these nations, right? And have them observe all that I'm commanding you, right? And in between that, right, as they convert, you baptize them, right? Okay, Romans 13. Owen's pretty good at saying, recognizing verse 1, let every person be subject to the governing authorities, right? All authority has been instituted by God, it's telling us, right? There's no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God, right? But then let's look at verse 3. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Immediately you have to ask, what is good conduct and what is bad? Who defines that, right? It can't be subjective. It can't be whatever the magistrate says. And we know that because we know objectively that, Hitler was wrong, as an example. We know objectively that Nebuchadnezzar was a bad guy until, if you hold that he converted, most people do, or he had some form of conversion anyhow. If you look at that, him before God humbled him, he's a bad dude objectively, right? Pharaoh, bad dude objectively, right? So it can't just be whatever the magistrate says, right? And so God defines what's good and God defines what's evil. God defines what's good conduct and what's bad. And so the rulers have an obligation to be a terror to what God calls bad conduct. All right. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good and you will receive his approval. That means that the civil magistrate is obligated to give approval to what God calls good. For he is God's servant. He's God's servant, God's deacon, God's magistrate, right? So he, being the civil magistrate, is a servant of God to do what God says. If you're somebody's servant, right, you're doing what they are commanding. You're doing the things that please them. You're doing things the way that they want them to be done, right? If you're their servant. And he's talking to Christians now. He's God's servant for your good, right? So again, you have to have a complete case of cognitive dissonance if you're trying to say that what Paul's doing here is upholding Nero Caesar and the Roman Empire and the way that they were doing things during the persecution of Christians, right? And then I'm going to continue on, but if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. So he's saying that the sword has a use. It's not born in vain. It's supposed to be there. The sword has a legitimate use that God ordains, and it's to punish what God calls evil. For he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer, right? So how some of these guys say, oh, we're not supposed to have Christian laws, we're not supposed to have Christian nations. I'm going to keep going, right? Because you might not say, yeah, Psalm 2 should be pretty convincing right there, right? As well as the Great Commission, but you might not be there yet. So Matthew 5:17-20. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I'm going to stop right there. I've said this in other episodes, but I'm going to say it again here. The Greek there is saying, do not even begin to think, right? Do not even begin to think that Jesus came to abolish the law or the prophets. Jesus says, I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever relaxes one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. Okay? So God is clearly upholding his law. Jesus is upholding God's law right there, saying that it's not abolished. You don't relax it. You don't teach other people to relax it. And if you do it and teach it, you'll be called great in the kingdom of heaven, right? The Lord's Prayer, Jesus' command to us. He's telling us how to pray. This is what we should desire and pray for, which means it's also what we should be acting towards. Pray then like this: Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come. Your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Right. Um, so, anyhow, I'm gonna stop there with the on that, and just say that it seems pretty self-explanatory to me that God did not do away with his law. He is not expecting for us to be political pagans or political polytheists. He's not looking for religious pluralism in the public square, right? He's saying that magistrates are obligated to uphold his law. It's supposed to be a Christian nation. We are supposed to honor him. The kings and rulers are supposed to kiss the Son, right? And so that needs to be our message. He says again, he just keeps harping on only the New Testament in recent podcasts, and then he talks about basically praying and doing nothing. There's no exhortation. He doesn't say pray and then act. He just talks about pray, pray, pray. Well, prayer is important, but what did we just read, right? God's praying God's telling us to pray for his will to be done on earth as it is in heaven. And anybody who puts any thought into this, what God is asking us to pray for, he's asking us to put our hand to the plow and work towards, right? It's like me saying, oh God, give me a house, right? Lord, I'm praying that you'll give me a house. I want a new home, and I want a lot of land, and I want a farm, and I want you to give me a lot of crops and a lot of animals that produce a lot for me, right? But then I don't do it. I don't save any money. I don't take any meaningful steps whatsoever to work towards that, right? Do I really have any faith in that? Am I really being obedient to Jesus Christ? Am I honoring God with my actions there? And it's an obvious no, right? But somehow these guys navel gaze, and they spiritualize this, and they say, oh, well, when it's in the political realm and the civil realm out there, right, then it's cool to do nothing and just pray, right? But everything else, you should take action, right? And actually act like you're expecting God to bless your efforts, because you're praying for that, and you know that God gives good gifts, right? I'm saying be consistent and apply that to your political action and your political theology. I'm going to skip a couple things that I was going to talk about, because I think we've already kind of touched on them. And I wanted to talk about this idea of religious liberty, right? He touches on that, and a lot of others who have been critical of Christian nationalism and especially theonomy will hit on this. And I just want to ask you the real question. And you should do not give a knee-jerk answer to this. I'm not even looking for you to answer me. I'm really looking for you to answer yourself, right? But from Scripture alone, can you honestly say that religious liberty, right? And when I say religious liberty, I don't mean just being Presbyterian or Baptist, right? Like we talked about what that language meant in the Constitution, right? But, do you really think that God is saying, it's no big deal if you're a Buddhist or a Hindu or a Muslim or whatever? Obviously, these are false religions. They lead people astray. They lead people to hell. That's eternal damnation, eternal torment, right? So this is worse than, even being killed in this life, right? There's nothing in this life that's that bad, right? And so are you really saying, and look at God's law, right? What did he do, and what did he command to be done? What did he command for his people to do with mediums and sorcerers and necromancers? What did he command them to do with witches, right? What did he command them to do with false prophets and people who told the people to chase after other gods, right? Just thinking about this, look at the 10 Commandments. Look at the first 3 of the 10 Commandments, right? Is God really saying that he's religiously neutral there in any way, shape, or form? And the answer is an unequivocal no, right? If you've read the Bible at all, and if you haven't, just like do some research on it. Just study it for yourself, read it for yourself. I'd encourage you to start in Exodus 20, right? And Deuteronomy 20 as well, and the retelling of the law. And look at that, and then look at all these other laws that correlate to that concept of God being have no other gods before him, right? And to not commit idolatry and to not take his name in vain, right? And do a real legitimate study on that. And you're going to find that God is not neutral and he doesn't want you to be either. In fact, Jesus made it clear there is no such thing as neutrality, right? Um, so then, you know how we talked earlier about Owen kind of sort of condemning pragmatism, and then he turns around and makes a pragmatic argument. Well, one of the things he said in the podcast, this was kind of funny. He was saying that the gospel was not most unleashed during the era of the magisterial reformers, right? And that's not really true. I guess I'll put the caveat there. It depends on what you mean by most unleashed, right? So I would care to hear him define that, but just on its face, no. You had, is he saying it was most unleashed in Puritan New England, and that's different, right? Is he saying that? Is he trying to say that, like maybe during the Great Awakening, that it was more quote unquote unleashed, right? You had a lot of false conversions there, but whatever. So I'm really curious what he means there. But if you look at the impact that it had on the culture, the change that it made to the actual culture and what they were doing, and how they were carrying out what God actually commands, and having an actual faith in the actual gospel and the actual God of Scripture, right? And clinging closely to that, right? I find that to be a very difficult argument for him to make, but I'm willing to hear. Maybe he meant something else, but certainly that's pragmatism, because we're even still, right? We're not looking at, well, there was 10 more converts at this point in time than at that point in time, so it must mean that they were doing things better, right? Well, you know what? Peter preached a sermon during a time when the pagans were ruling, and people, the Jews, right, God's people at the time, right, as as we're transitioning into the church, right, where they were arguably the most wicked and most disobedient, and Peter preaches a sermon that the Holy Spirit causes to turn 3,000 people to Christ in one day, right? And one day, one sermon, right? That's pretty good results, right? That doesn't mean that, therefore, the Roman government was doing things right. It doesn't mean that therefore the unbelieving Jews were doing things right, and it doesn't mean that therefore we shouldn't care about any of these things. Obviously, all three of those things would be wrong, right? We should care, and obviously know they were not doing things right. But that doesn't mean that God can't, use the gospel powerfully, a proclamation of the gospel, and change hearts with it, right? And it doesn't mean that it doesn't mean we shouldn't be proclaiming the gospel in the public, right, and from house to house, just like Paul instructs us in the book of Acts, chapter 20, right? And at the same time, it doesn't mean that even if God decides to make the gospel more effective at one particular time than another, that somehow we should therefore say, oh, well, then that must mean that we're doing something wrong. No, we know that we're doing something wrong when we look at what we're doing politically and civically, and how well or not well that lines up with God's commands. That's when we know whether or not we're doing well. And then, again with the straw man, he says, can you vanquish sin, unbelief, and falsehood or heresy, right? Through having a nation that honors Christ as Lord, like that says that they're a Christian nation. Well, saying that you're a Christian nation or we're having Christian laws vanquish sin, unbelief, and heresy. And my question is that really what he thinks we're saying the goal is, right? Obviously, we want God to vanquish these things. And obviously, through the proclamation of the gospel, we want to see these things minimized. And through righteous laws that catechize the people and restrain evil, we want to see some of these things mitigate. And God is doing all the work through all of that, right? He's the one who's really doing the work. He's the one who really changes the hearts. And, but having righteous laws is not the same as saying, oh, well, I think that's going to vanquish heresy and that's going to vanquish unbelief. See, that's a silly jump, right? What we're saying is that the civil magistrate has a duty to mitigate these things, right? That the law restrains some of these things, especially when you have a particularly immoral people, right? They don't have the Spirit of God, giving them some self-restraint prior to coming up against the law, right? And so they need that law, right? But the law is about justice, and justice is a good and important thing. Jesus said it's one of the weightier matters of the law. That's Matthew 23:23. It's right there with mercy and faithfulness, right? So two very important things, right? Calls those the weightier matters of the law. You should take Jesus's words there seriously. And if you do, then you realize justice isn't something that you can be indifferent about, right? You can't be unprincipled about it. Like it requires biblical principle, and it requires you to take it very seriously as though it is a weightier matter. So how he says that this is just more straw manning, right? He's making arguments for them that they're not making, right? And I'm gonna end on this. He's saying we shouldn't give up on America, right? It's like this big, almost like a campaign speech in a way, in the sense like, he's using all this sentiment towards, whether or not we give up on America. Well, I would say the people who are actually trying to salvage what is good and establish good where that has been lost completely, or maybe where we never had it, right? Those are the people that aren't giving up on America, right? But I would certainly say this. I mean, if we're a righteous people, we should be doing something to actively affect change in the culture around us, right? Godly things, right? Things that we see God commanding in the scripture, right? We should be doing all of those things, right? But if we're not doing those things, right, we should be praying also that, if God isn't going to save the people, if he isn't going to change the people or restrain them in some way, that God would judge the people, right? Because we should want to see God being honored throughout the earth, and God bringing his judgment or his mercy, grace, and salvation, one or the other, to any people that dishonor him. And so if you have this position where it's like, well, we should just really not want anything to change, but be comfortable in that, I don't see how that's loving your country or loving Christ or loving his church or any of that, right? I actually find that an incredibly distasteful sentiment. So that's going to be it for this episode. I hope it was a blessing to you. If it was, smash that thumbs up button. And make sure you share this with some other people. If you haven't already, please subscribe and click the bell icon for notifications. And if you really didn't care for this, make sure you hit that thumbs down button twice, and you can leave a comment in the comment section. We'd love to hear from you. Until next time, may God bless you, and have a blessed Lord's Day this weekend.